presentar a Francesco Ficetola. Francesco es uno de los herpetólogos más influyentes en temas relacionados a la biología de la conservación, principalmente de anfibios y reptiles en el momento. Su trabajo combina distintos enfoques y teorías de diversas disciplinas como la macroecología, la ecología del paisaje, la genética, la ecología evolutiva, con el fin de principalmente entender los efectos de los disturbios antrópicos sobre la biodiversidad y comprender también los patrones de distribución de la biodiversidad. Él es profesor de la Universidad de Milano. Probablemente muchos de ustedes lo conozcan, es un investigador sumamente productivo, tiene más de 200 artículos publicados, 150 en los últimos 10 años, es autor principal de más de 100 de estos artículos y ha publicado en revistas como Nature Communication, Global Chinese Biology. Bueno, tiene un índice H altísimo, es asesor de la IUCN a escala nacional y continental, y lo más importante de todo es que Francesco es un investigador sumamente dispuesto a colaborar, a charlar, sumamente abierto a eso, y está particularmente interesado por temas de conservación en neotrópico en los últimos años. Así que bueno, Francesco, es un gusto tenerte con nosotros. We're ready.
Muchas gracias, es con mucho gusto que yo soy aquí, pero no habla español bastante bien, so I'm gonna speak in English, but eventually when you make your questions, you can do that. I understand Spanish more or less, so you can eventually, if you prefer, make your question in English, and I'll try to, but I'll have to answer in English, sorry. Okay, so many thanks for the presentation. I'm gonna talk about a series of studies we have done in the last decade on the impact on invasive species at different scales. Invasive species are one of the largest causes of biodiversity loss, and out of the 800 extinctions that occurred because of human impact in the last centuries, invasive species are involved in about 33%. And the impact of invasive species is particularly strong in fresh waters, where a really high proportion of environments have been invaded by invasive species. And invasive species are not just a problem for today, because as you can see from this plot, the number of new invasive species is quickly growing all around the world. So every year we have new and new introductions of non-native species that likely will cause increasing problems in the future. And the growing number of invasive species is evident for all the taxonomic groups. We can have many different potential impacts of invasive species on native species. We can measure the impact of invasive species in the short term, and some invasive species are predators, others are heavy competitors of native species. Some invasive species cause habitat alteration, some can spread diseases, and of course the interactions can be very complex. But detecting, for example, the predation by an invasive species on a native species does not mean always that the invasive species will cause a decline. For example, it's possible that yes, the predation will cause in the long term the decline or the extinction of native species, but there are also cases in which actually we did not see any change or even increases are possible. And so predicting the long-term consequences of invasive species is very challenging. And there are multiple impacts of invasive species on native species that range from, as I told you, predation, competition, hybridization, habitat alteration, and spread of diseases. But in many cases, we can have complex interactions. In a very influential paper published about 20 years ago now, it was clearly stated that the declines of amphibians are in most of cases caused by multiple and different biotic and abiotic factors that act together. But in reality, the majority of research on invasive species is based on short-term assessments, and in many cases, the research focuses on just one or very few parameters. So in the last 10 years, more or less, we have tried to understand what have been the long-term and broad-scale impacts of native species on amphibians, trying to understand how the invasive species interact with other environmental pressures, and finally, I'll discuss also on how invasive species can affect the intra-specific diversity, so not just the extinction or the number of species. This is the main actor of my presentation, even if I'm gonna speak a little bit also about other invasive species, which is the North American red-worm crayfish. It's a native of North America, but actually there are invasive species all around the world, and large parts of the world, mostly in temperate regions, are suitable and suffer a high invasion risk. So the introduction, and most of the studies I'm going to show you are from Italy, so in the Mediterranean part of Europe, where this crayfish has been introduced about 30 years ago and is spreading fastly, mostly in the last 15, 20 years. And the impact of this crayfish, as opposed to other invasive species, the impact of this crayfish can be very complex because it can feed on multiple items. It can feed on plants, amphibian larvae, on insects. And to try understanding the impact of this crayfish, we have tried to perform a regular monitoring on multiple ponds since now more than 20 years. So the very first analysis showed that at least for some amphibians, the crayfish had a strong predation pressure, and there is a number of species, here you see them on the left, that don't breed on invaded wetlands. So we have the impression that those species, for example, the salamanders or the newts, tend to avoid invasive species, so they are losing breeding sites. But actually, there are also a number of species, such as some frog species, that continue to breed in the invaded wetlands. And if we just measure the abundance of the tadpoles of both newts and frogs, we see lower abundances in the invaded wetlands. So this suggested that the predation pressure can have a severe effect on the survival of tadpoles. But maybe things are more complex because actually the invasive species don't prey just on the amphibians, but they can prey on the rest of the community. So for example, the mesopredator release hypothesis focus on systems where you have predators at different levels in the trophic web and prey. So for larvae, for amphibian larvae, there are plenty of aquatic insects that prey on amphibians, and we know that the abundance of the predators can reduce the abundance of prey. But what happens when I introduce a new top predator? It's possible that it decreases the abundance of mesopredators, and this causes a reduction of predation pressure on the tadpoles, and so a rebound of that abundance. So just to sum up, the theory predicts that the amphibian communities are reduced by the predation by insects, but if the mesopredator is reduced by the addition of an invasive top predator, perhaps we could see a reduction of the pressure against tadpoles, so maybe that the amphibians can survive. So we have performed an assessment of the abundance and the biomass of the whole components of amphibian communities, of the communities including both amphibians and the insects and the crayfish. And yes, we found a negative pressure of the insects on the amphibian larvae, and yes, we found that the crayfish reduce the abundance of native predators. But in fact, the impact of the crayfish on amphibians is much stronger than the impact on native predators. And so what happens is that the invasive predator is much stronger than any native predator, and so at the end, the amphibian abundance decreases even if we reduce the abundance of negative predation by the predators. So just to sum up, yes, the insects can reduce the abundance of amphibians, and the crayfish reduce the abundance of the predators. But in fact, this invasive crayfish is so strong in terms of impact that it overrides the impact of any native predator. But those studies were performed just after the invasion by the crayfish, and what have been the impacts 15 years after the onset of the invasion? So what have been the long-term impacts? As you can see, the crayfish, this is our study area that is a very complex area in northern Italy, with both urban areas, agricultural areas, and natural areas. And you can see that the crayfish clearly increased its distribution through time, but it has not invaded every single wetland. And for several species, we detected a clear decline at the regional scale. For example, for the smooth newt, you see that about 50% of ponds where it used to live don't host any more population. So we had a decline of 50% at the regional scale, and many species suffered such decline with reduced occupancy now compared to what was 15 years ago. But in fact, the pattern must be more complex because the invasive species, the crayfish, has not invaded all the ponds. So there are situations where populations went extinct even if the crayfish has not invaded all the ponds. So how can a local invasion of just a limited number of ponds determine the broad-scale decline? And is it possible that an invasive species causes extinction even in ponds that have not been invaded yet. So to understand which are the processes that determine the broad-scale impact of the crayfish and the decline of amphibians, we must remember that amphibians often live in specially structured populations. So let me check if I can. Do you see the laser? Yes. So in a specially structured population, you have sink populations that receive immigrants from source ponds, and the long-term persistence in a given pond is caused by the balance between local extinction and the colonization from nearby patches. So I have a balance, and the presence in a given site also depends on what happens in the nearby sites. So the crayfish, in principle, could cause the decline of the amphibians through multiple potential effects. So, for example, it could have effects at the patch level. Maybe because of predation, it increases the extinction of populations that are inside the invaded patches, or maybe the invaded patches don't receive colonizers, and so they can go extinct in long term because of the lack of immigrants. Or maybe you can imagine a landscape effect of the crayfish. So an alternative hypothesis is that the sites that are surrounded by invaded patches don't receive colonizers, and this causes the decline at the regional scale, even if a single pond has not been invaded by the crayfish. So to test those hypotheses, we ran occupancy models on 10 distinct species, and the occupancy in a given year in a given pond is related to the survival of that species in the pond and to the possibility that the pond is colonized from nearby ponds. And in turn, the survival of the population can be affected by the features of the pond and the presence of the crayfish in the pond. On the other hand, the colonization can be affected by the habitat features, the occurrence of the crayfish at the patch, and also by the features of nearby patches, because the possibility that a pond is colonized is larger if the focal species, so the species I'm studying, is frequently present in nearby sites. But maybe the crayfish in nearby site can have negative impacts on colonization. So I just show you as an example for this specific frog species that the survival of the species in the long term is essentially related to the surface of the pond. So larger ponds have a better survival of these species, while the presence of the crayfish don't affect the survival of the species and doesn't affect also the colonization by this frog. But what happens is that the colonization is strongly negatively affected by the occurrence of the crayfish in nearby patches. If you run the same model for all the species, you see that, yes, for a couple of species, you have a direct negative impact of the crayfish on the survival of the population. But in fact, you have a much more widespread impact of the crayfish on the colonization. If we make, for example, through a meta-analytic approach, an estimate of the average effect of all the potential drivers, you see that essentially the survival of populations is mostly related to the surface and the permanence of the pond, the occurrence of the fish species, which are another issue, and most of fish species are non-native, generally decrease the survival of the population. The crayfish presence, yes, has some negative effect on the presence of some species, but definitely is not so pervasive. Sorry. But if you give a look to the impacts on the colonization by individuals of the same species, you see that crayfish has a very general and negative impact as the ponds that are surrounded by many invaded populations of the ponds that are surrounded by many invaded sites suffer a lower colonization level compared to the ones that are not in an invaded landscape. And the incidence of the target species increases the colonization, because if a pond is close to another one where my frog species is present, the probability of colonization is higher. So, just to sum up, invasive species have consequences at the landscape scale. Because the dynamics of metapopulations depends on the balance between extinctions and colonizations, and the colonization by nearby ponds can greatly increase the distribution of target species. But what happens is that the crayfish reduces the breeding output of all the amphibians, so less immigrants are available and can colonize nearby ponds. So in the long term, the occupancy decreases even if the adults continue to breed in invaded or in not invaded wetlands. And the decline can occur even if the population is still able to survive in one or very few. Okay, what I showed you is mostly related to a set of ponds in a small area. It may be interesting, but is it possible that invasive species cause broad-scale trends at very large scale? Of course, if you want to have broad-scale and long-term trends, you need broad-scale and long-term data. So most generally, it's not possible to do it directly, and we try to assess this using a meta-analytic approach, essentially by collecting many different data sets from the literature. And we assessed which are the main drivers of population trends, considering three potential drivers: so the change of climate, the change in habitat availability for target species, and the number of invasive species. Of course, all those drivers determine the population trends. So, for example, we assessed the impact of climate, and as you know, every species can both take advantage or disadvantage from climate change. And essentially, for target species, suitability can increase or decrease, and in the populations where suitability has increased in the last decades, populations have increased in abundance. the number of invasive species that are present has a negative impact on the trend of populations. And actually, the richness of invasive species is the predictor with the strongest effect size. And the habitat availability slightly tend to cause a positive impact on the abundance of populations. But we also found a complex and very interesting interaction between the habitat availability and the population trends. Essentially, if a population lives in an area with low habitat availability, the decline will be much stronger than in areas where there is high habitat availability. So if there is a lot of habitat, amphibians can withstand with the impact of invasive species. But if the habitats are very limited, the impact of invasive species can be much stronger. Now I'm gonna show you a couple of recent studies we have done on the intra-specific variation. I'm gonna show you two examples. One are the pedomorphic newts. So in many newts and salamander species, you have the possibility of pedomorphic population where...
Dottor Ficetola, mi scusi, la interrompo un secondo. Mi hanno detto dal comitato organizzatore che non si sente bene a volte. Volevo chiedere se può spegnere la videocamera, per favore, così vediamo se può migliorare. Mi scusi per il disturbo.
Ok, I turn off the camera.
Perfetto, grazie mille.
Prego. Okay, and maybe I speak closer to the microphone, so maybe this is also useful. So newts often have pedomorphic populations where the adults can breed without passing the metamorphosis. And this is an example in a population of central France, where the presence of pedomorphic newts in a population is strongly related to the presence of fish. In this landscape, the fish in the fish species are not native of ponds. They have been introduced by humans, and there is a very quick loss of pedomorphic newts in the sites where fish have been invaded. And in the long term, the introduction of fish species can cause loss of pedomorphic newts at the country scale. This is a study we have done in Montenegro, and here you have a map of Montenegro. So Montenegro is in Eastern Europe, where you can see that about 40, 50 years ago, there were lakes all around the country with pedomorphic populations of newts, where you had both pedomorphic and metamorphic individuals. But if you go back to the same site today, in most of cases, the orange or the red dots, we only find metamorphs. So the pedomorphic populations are extinct. And there are even cases where there are no newts at all. So both metamorphs and metamorphs are extinct. And the sites, the few sites where we still have pedomorphs and metamorphs are the ones where no fish populations have been introduced. So in those cases, we have observed a dramatic decline of newts, even if the habitat has not really changed in the last 50 years, but the pedomorphic newts suffered a much faster decline compared to the metamorphic populations. And essentially, the decline of Paedomorphs was much faster. Now we have lost more than 95% of the distribution of Paedomorphic species. The last example I'm going to show you is again related to the crayfish invasion, and is showing how incredibly fast can be the evolutionary response by native amphibians to a strong predation pressure, such the one that is exerted by the crayfish. So I'm going to show you a study we've done on frog species that is endemic of lowlands of northern Italy. And this frog has a very limited altitudinal range. So the highest altitude where it can live is about 350, 400 meters. And you have both populations living in lowlands, where temperature in spring is relatively warm, and populations living on the foothill, where spring populations are about 2 degrees lower compared to lowland populations. So this study is, the roots of this study date back to 2003, when, before the invasion by crayfish, we assessed the evolutionary differences between the lowland and the foothill populations. And so we kept tadpoles from lowland and foothill populations under the same breeding conditions. And what we found is that at the same temperature, foothill populations have a faster development. Why? Because in nature, the low temperature of foothill populations slows down their development rate. So those populations have evolved a faster intrinsic development rate to counteract the selective gradient that reduce the development rate in nature. But since 2003, environmental conditions have really changed a lot. Not for the climate, but for the predators. So more than 50% of the populations have been now invaded by the crayfish. But still we have a mix with some populations that have not been invaded yet. So we try to see if the populations evolved the responses to withstand the crayfish, and if the intra-specific variation that we observed before the invasion is still present. This was the PhD study of Andrea. So in 2017, we repeated the same common rearing experiment, and we found very strong differences in development rate between tadpoles that were collected in not invaded ponds and the sites that were actually invaded by crayfish. So what does it mean? It means that tadpoles have a faster development if their pond is invaded, because this reduces the time tadpoles remain in water, and so it reduces the exposure of the tadpoles to the crayfish. So this suggests a very, very fast evolutionary response to essentially limit the exposure to the invasive predator. But what happens is that now the differences that were detected between the lowland and foothill populations are not detectable anymore, because the invasive species is now clearly a stronger selective force compared to the climatic gradient that we detected 20 years ago. And of course, this fast evolution is expected to reduce the exposure to the crayfish, and so it should limit its impact. And this is a great representation of how fast amphibians can evolve to try to withstand the new pressures caused by global change. But we don't see anymore the gradient related to the climatic regime, and so we don't know what can be the long-term impacts on the adaptive populations of the population, for example, because climate is changing, so having the ability to respond to climate change is also very important. So just to sum up, invasive species are a very, very strong driver of amphibian decline, and in some areas they can be the strongest driver. And we can have strong amphibian declines even in areas where habitat changes have been limited, but they have a complex interaction with environmental drivers. Still, the impact of invasive species can be very complex and can be heterogeneous, for example, between amphibians with different life history strategies. Of course, the main question is ensuring the long-term persistence of amphibian populations, and not just of amphibian populations. Of course, amphibians are just one example of animals that are severely impacted by invasive species. What can we do? Well, prevention is the most important thing. Introductions continue to occur everywhere in the world, so limiting the new introductions, for example, through trade regulation, is definitely the most important thing. We have to reduce the trade of potentially invasive species, and we have to avoid that invasive species or potentially invasive species are released again in nature. The prediction of long-term effects can be difficult, but in any case, it's increasingly evident that the impact of invasive species often occur at broad scale. So we cannot just give a look to the pond where my amphibian populations live, but we have to make a management at the landscape scale, considering multiple sites at the same moment, if we want to make effective conservation actions. So it was really a pleasure speaking. A bit sorry for not being present physically. I really hope to be able to come physically in the future. And so thank you again for the invitation and for listening to me. And I have to say absolutely thank you to many colleagues and students that have worked with me in the last 15 years. Without their help, all of this would not have been possible. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Congrats. It has been really nice to see how you combine different techniques and scales to ask very related questions. Now we will start with the question. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta para Francesco?
Javi, hay una pregunta escrita.
Vamos a abrirlos en chat.
Es la voz que tiene mejor pronunciación.
Hello, Francesco. Are you taking into account some measure of habitat connectivity as an influential variable in the occupation dynamics of invasive species?
Yes, so as I explained, so the idea is to take all the parameters into account at the same moment. So the idea is to measure the landscape configuration behind the presence of invasive species, and also yes, to take into account the connectivity between each wetland and the nearby ones. So we have to use a very simplified measure of potential connectivity because we have a very complex system. But even if we simplify a little bit the way we connect the ponds, yes, this is absolutely important because the connectivity allows the flow of individual, and then we have seen clearly that in the long term, the connections are really the main driver of the trends.
Thank you. Gracias. Noelia, no sé si quedó respondida. Si querés abrir tu micrófono, volver a escribir en el chat. ¿Alguna otra persona que levante la mano?
¿No?
Acá tenemos una pregunta para vos.
Estoy acá. Hola. Pregunto en español y si no, te pregunto en inglés. ¿No se escucha?
No se te ve.
Ah, bueno, pero estoy acá. En cuanto a la observación que hiciste de las salamandras que se ven afectadas, las que son pedomórficas y no el morfotipo que metamorfosea, yo te pregunto primero, ¿esa especie es facultativa o son dos morfos separados, digamos?
It is facultative pedomorphosis, but there are probably, particularly for Montenegro, and so for the French population, there are studies ongoing to understand the genetic basis of pedomorphosis, but for the population in Montenegro, so it is a facultative pedomorphosis, but likely there is also some genetic component that caused a very high incidence of pedomorphosis in those populations that were much higher than in other populations living in nearby areas. So probably we are losing the intra-specific genetic diversity that increased a lot the frequency of pedomorphosis, and only the metamorphic ones remain. But it is a facultative pedomorphic species, but we always have some genetic component that causes differences in the rate of pedomorphic animals across populations.
O sea, no es que todas las pedomórficas pasan a metamorfosis, digamos, sino que se pierde ese morfotipo, sería una.
Yeah, they are morphotypes. Yeah, they can spend 3 years as pedomorphic newt, and then the year after they can metamorphose.
Gracias.
This was demonstrated for the French populations.
Nicola.
Okay, I hope you can hear me because I have some connection problems. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, Dr. Ficetola, I am a fellow Italian. I was a student at the National University of Ferrara. I interrupted you before. So it's really interesting to actually listen again about the crayfish. So I remember when I was at Ferrara that there was a proposition at some point for controlling the population of crayfish to actually catch them and sell them. I don't know if it was actually implemented, at least in Ferrara. I don't know if it's actually viable. Do you have any, have you heard about that? Have you heard about that way on controlling or managing the crayfish?
Sorry, which was the strategy? Catching them and?
Catching them and selling them in the local market.
Okay, just for food for humans. Yeah, so there are several problems. The first one is that if you convince people that the crayfish is good for food, the number of new introductions will increase. You're not really controlling the abundance, but you are probably favoring new introductions. The second problem is that I'm aware of a restaurant that opened with the aim of just serving the crayfish, and actually the restaurants bankrupt because they are not so good for us, and they are also bioaccumulators. So honestly, I suggest my students that go around and I say them, if you catch them, don't make a barbecue with the crayfish, because they are not really a healthy food for us, unfortunately, because they also live a lot in not very clean water. So a crayfish that live in a polluted water can accumulate a lot of things, so it's not very a great idea in my opinion.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Yeah, I remember I heard about that plan, and I didn't know if it was actually implemented. So it seems it is impossible, actually.
No. Actually, they are everywhere because of they originated from bankrupted rearing facilities. So if the first rearing facilities have bankrupt, imagine. People don't like them. They are not the same. They are not like the shrimps. The sea shrimps that are much better.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Aprovecho para preguntar. Ay, Mariana Poeta va a preguntar. Puedes abrir tu micrófono.
Hola. Hello, Francesco. Your talk was very nice. I'm going to ask in English. Espero que se me entienda. When you show the avoid of breeding site by some species of amphibians, evitar los lugares, ¿no? para poner las puestas, or to avoid to colonize some place. The mechanism to avoid is specific of crayfish, or maybe it's for another alien species or another different species. You understand my question?
Yeah. So what we have seen is that essentially the species that avoid the ponds with the crayfish are mostly species that stay a lot of time in water. So we have not detected the mechanism, but probably what happens is that the animals go inside the pond, they stay there for, in principle, they can stay there for weeks before the breeding season, but actually they start to interact with the crayfish, and so they escape, they search up for a different place. While the species that continue to breed inside the ponds with the crayfish are mostly explosive breeders. So actually, for explosive breeders, the animals stay in the water just for one night, 3 hours. So the possibility that they really interact with the crayfish is much lower. This is what is our strongest hypothesis on the difference between species that avoid and species that don't avoid the invaded site.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Yo tengo una curiosidad, Francesco. ¿Cuál es tu criterio para diferenciar short terms and long terms?
I think that short term and long terms are just human categories, but so what happens is that in many cases there is a very nice review by John Macy on the impact of invasive species on amphibians, and really the majority of studies have been performed in the lab for 1 season.
Okay.
This is clearly short term, and then the question remains on what are the impacts on multiple generations. So this is what we could perhaps call the long terms.
Okay. Bueno, gracias. Damos un aplauso.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Gracias, Francesco. Ahora vamos a ir a un receso y en unos minutos iniciamos la sesión.